Ross Legal Corporation is a full-service boutique law firm based in Encino, California. Ross Legal's partners bring a combined 40-plus years of experience at nationally recognized law firms and as in-house general counsel with preeminent companies. Ross Legal counsels diverse clients ranging from individuals to multinational corporations on commercial litigation, intellectual property, technology, internet, data privacy, general corporate and compliance matters, real estate and construction transactions, disputes and mechanics liens, as well as new media, entertainment, energy, and apparel matters. Their attorneys provide exceptional legal services in a cost-effective manner. Visit them at rosslegalcorp.com or call 818-906-9667. That's 818-906-9667. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's great to be here. My bio is at the back, so I won't tell too much about myself. But yeah, I do focus on corporate governance and intellectual property, commercial transactions, and I serve as outside general counsel to a number of companies in the tech and internet space, as well as cannabis. And my partner, Paulina Ross, handles litigation, property law, and business disputes. So I thought we would give a little bit of an overview today on where we're at and how we got here in terms of cannabis, how it's treated under U.S. law and locally. Oh, thank you. And then we could jump right into some, more germane real estate related issues. So here's a little overview. So at the federal level, as you know, probably cannabis or marijuana is considered completely illegal, has no accepted medical use, is unsafe, and therefore is on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it's treated like plutonium. There's this growing body of anecdotal evidence that it actually has a lot of benefits, and in fact we could talk about the federal government itself having a patent on medical use and the FDA recently approving a drug for medical use. So in short, this may change in the near future, but for today, possession, cultivation, and sale of cannabis remain federal crimes. And this was reinforced by the Supreme Court a number of years ago in the Gonzalez v. Reich case, where they took a tortured interpretation of the Commerce Clause to basically say that federal law governs. The feds are still allowed to prohibit cannabis use, even if state law allows it. And as a cautionary tale, I put in here a little mention of a fellow named Chris Bardowitz, who was growing as a medical provider in Colorado, and the DEA and the DOJ coordinated to raid him and prosecute him, and he tried to raise state law compliance as a defense, and that didn't fly because they were able to argue that he actually violated state law in the number of plants he was growing, so he went to jail. Colorado, where he was, is in the 10th Circuit. In the 9th Circuit, we have some more favorable case rulings based on a piece of congressional law called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, or Rohrabacher-Blumenauer, which shields operators from federal prosecution, essentially, if they're in strict compliance with state law. So, circuit by circuit, the courts have to interpret this, and hopefully one day this so-called Rohrabacher Amendment will be made permanent. But for today, we live in the shifting sands. As I've mentioned here on my slide as well, it also depends on who's president, what the administration is doing. So under Obama, the DOJ took a position, and there was a deputy general counsel named James Cole who put out this guidance memo to all of his prosecutors. And he basically said, look, if operators in a state are essentially complying with 8 of our policy directives, then we'll probably leave them alone, because it's just not a good use of scarce prosecutorial resources to go after them. So no diverting cannabis over state lines, don't sell to kids, don't deal with cartels, don't use guns, don't grow on federal land, that sort of thing. And when Trump came in, his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, decided to repeal that memo, and it left everyone in more of a state of confusion. And it hasn't actually resulted in a lot more prosecutions yet, but nonetheless, people are not quite sure which way the winds are blowing. Trump has made inconsistent statements on the campaign trail and then in office about whether he is actually going to, respect state rights and let medical laws, be. I mentioned a case called Murphy. I want to talk about it here. It's really a case about gambling but it could theoretically be applied to give states a little more leeway in enacting and their own laws around cannabis, commercial cannabis activity, and personal use. And finally, I just want to point out that every year, as the public becomes more and more receptive and understanding about cannabis, whether on the medical level or the adult use level, bills are introduced to reform the state of laws, and they may want to try to drop cannabis down from a Schedule I classification to something less strict, or remove it entirely, or leave it where it is, but say that if you're in compliance with state law, we'll sort of exempt you out of the Controlled Substances Act. But there's a couple of guys on committees in the House who routinely kill these bills before they get to the vote, or even to a debate. Well, I view that as undemocratic, but that's the process we have. And if people in Texas, for example, want to vote out Pete Sessions and replace him with someone else who will let these bills get to an honest debate, then that'll be their prerogative. So let's talk for a second about state law. California is a unique beast. California is the largest cannabis market in the country, perhaps the world. And California has taken a pretty laissez-faire approach to cannabis up until very recently. So in the 70s, a number of states started decriminalizing small possession, and California was one of those states. And then in the mid-90s, we actually were the first state to introduce medical use laws through a proposition and then a law. But we didn't really regulate the industry, so it was sort of like the Wild West, and you could go into these dispensaries and get these products. They weren't tested. The dispensaries might be raided. There was all these machinations people had to go through to create these medical collectives and associations in order for this to be considered, halfway legal. And it never really was legal. It just provided you a defense if you were prosecuted. So in 2015, the state finally decided to put a comprehensive framework on board. And over the next 3 years, first there was a set of laws around medical cannabis, and then there was a voter proposition, Prop 64, around adult use of cannabis. And then all this was consolidated last year into what's called MALCURSA, which, if you want to know, is the Medicinal and Adult Use Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act. It's a mouthful. And part of what that did was it also established regulatory power among 3 agencies in the state. And right now, in 2018, we're moving California's black market into a regulated industry, and it's a very clunky, confusing, torturous process, but it is happening. And if you get any of these news articles about the ever-shifting sands, you'll know about this. We could talk about it more if we want. But there's still struggles in the industry. Tax rates are super high because under the IRS code, you, as a cannabis business, you're trafficking in a controlled substance, and you cannot take ordinary business deductions. You can, however, in computing your gross income, deduct cost of goods sold, and we could talk about that a little bit more if we want, or, I would prefer to bring in an experienced accountant to dig through that. And there's also a lot of onerous state and local taxes in California right now. And all this is contributing to what is my last bullet point there, which is competition from the black market remains strong. So if you're a regulated, licensed retailer, for example, and the guy down the street isn't paying any taxes, he or she can offer, a great discount. There's still problems obtaining banking services and financing. There are people who offer alternative payment platforms like Ken Burke of PayQuick.
My partner.
Janice's partner, yeah. Insurance is difficult to get, but that's getting easier. The California Insurance Commissioner has his eye on this, and he's pushing carriers and admitted carriers to start offering more products to the industry. And you could still get raided. You could still have your assets seized. There's still no protection because under federal law, this is all still considered illegal. And you could be subject to prosecution, not only under the Controlled Substances Act, but people are starting to bring RICO claims. RICO is the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act. Thank you. So essentially, if you can show that there's a criminal conspiracy, which would be growing cannabis or selling cannabis, and that's causing you damage, like reduced property values, or what have you, then you can presumably make a RICO claim. And right now there's different claims pending in different circuits, and we'll see how that goes. It's a new trend. And nonetheless, the industry is growing year over year, 30%. It's predicted to continue for the next 15, 20 years. Already more than half the country allows medicinal cannabis. More and more are allowing adult use, and most allow CBD. And if you've heard a lot of talk about CBD, that's one of the derivative compounds from the plant that doesn't really have a psychoactive effect. It has more of a relaxing effect, anti-anxiety. There needs to be more controlled, double-blind studies, but already people are starting to realize that it's effective against certain seizures and other maladies. And most states have allow CBD. It depends how it's derived, whether it comes from cannabis plants or hemp plants that have a lower strength of THC. Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But another interesting thing is not only are 12 or 13 states in the U.S. considering reforms this year, but the UN is actually considering rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to something else. And if that happens, under international treaties it gets rescheduled, that's probably going to trigger the U.S. to look at our own laws as well. And whether we have reform bills get through the Congress or whether the pressure comes from the UN, I think we're bound to see a rescheduling at some point. It's just a matter of when. And more politicians are jumping on board because they realize cannabis is more popular than they are. 90% plus of Americans, when recent polls, approve of medical, and over 50 or 60% approve of adult, or at least they approve of the feds not coming in and tampering with state programs. So compare that against, the approval ratings of Congress or any president or whomever. So, how are we doing on time, by the way?
Probably about 5 more minutes.
Okay, all right.
Maybe you can focus a little bit on how it affects maybe property or landlords or something that...
Sure, I will. Thank you. So in terms of real estate, a lot of these grows are underground and they're not really marketed publicly, so it's good to work with experienced realtors, consultants, and professional CPAs and attorneys. That's my overall theme here. But of course, if you're buying a property, you're going to go through all the regular due diligence, considering your client's business needs. But you also have to take into account very specific zoning requirements. All these laws around cannabis are locally driven, so each city or county has their own unique requirements. Some set up green zones where as long as you're in a compliant zone, you're fine. Others make you go through a CUP process. You just have to know what locale you're looking at. You also have to consider most of these laws require you to be a certain distance from certain sensitive uses like schools or rehab centers or daycare centers. A lot of places say 1,000 feet because if you think about federal laws, being within 1,000 feet of a school triggers, sentencing enhancements. But LA, for example, says, if you're a retailer, 700 feet. And also, if you're talking about real estate, you have to think about financing. If there's any traditional financing on real estate, that could be a problem. If they learn about cannabis use in the building, the lender might come in and call the loan, and or your line of credit on your business might be canceled, or it might flow into other lines of credit you have in unrelated businesses at the same bank. So just keep an eye on that. And if you're not buying a property but you're leasing, there's one thing I like to hammer home is that if you just use a boilerplate agreement, it's probably going to be ill-fitting for cannabis. Because, for example, they usually say any illegal use is forbidden and, is a violation. So you need to X that out. And you should also consider some of the things I've laid out here. So make sure the lease explicitly talks about cannabis activity. So the landlord later on, if you're the tenant, the landlord later on can't say that they didn't know and this is, a violation and you're getting kicked out. Also, if you're going to be seeking a license, which you should, make sure the landlord promises to provide a letter of authorization in connection with your application so that they know and consent to the use. That's a requirement. I don't know if we need to go through all these in detail. I can if we want, but
we're a little tight on time.
We're tight on time.
Maybe a little bit of a summary, and obviously this is a great subject that could really devote an entire hour in the future.
Yeah.
There's so much that this subject, crosses over with and just deep, deals with.
Right.
So maybe a little bit of a summary would be great.
Sure. Thanks for pushing me through that. I appreciate it. In short, there's a lot of information in here, and if you ever want to call me, I can help you talk through some of these questions. I would just step back and realize any client who comes to you, they're going to have to go through a very detailed, comprehensive process in vetting their property, in applying for licenses at the local and state level, working with all the regulatory agencies, and they should consult closely with an experienced CPA who understands the industry, probably a lawyer who's had experience in the industry, because there's just a litany of issues. Every traditional business faces certain issues, and cannabis businesses are no different, except they have this federal law issue and this regulatory overlay, which just increases the complexity, and there's certain customs and practices that you need to understand in the cannabis industry. I tell clients all the time, you're not in the cannabis business, you're in the compliance business. And if you do that effectively, you'll get the opportunities to be part of this cool, interesting industry, but always keep your eye on that ball. And that's probably about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. The takeaway was the compliance business. I think that's really important. So we appreciate it, and thank you. And Brian's